Ohr. Wie viel Uhr ist hier wohl? 10 Uhr. Wie viel Uhr ist hier wohl? Mittag.
A true discourse, declaring the damnable life of an insatiable bloodsucker.
The mythology around wolves and that idea of a wolf being something to revere and fear has been around since the Bible. Herodotus, father of history, before that, Roman poet Ovid, they all wrote about wolves. But actually it wasn't until this pamphlet emerged in the late 1500s that we have a blueprint for the werewolf story as we know it today.
This vile wretch, having a tyrannous heart and a most cruel, bloody mind, requested that at his pleasure he might work his malice on men, women, and children in the town of Bedburg.
A small village like Bedburg would have perhaps at most a few hundred people living in it. They would live a quite precarious existence. They would be living close to nature, close to the forest. Most people would basically scratch a living. They would be either cutting wood or they would be keeping sheep. They're very lawless places in the sense that there's no police force, there's no unitary state. There would be a very limited sense of peace and security in a place like Bedburg. A couple of hundred years ago, the Black Death had wiped out 1/3 of the population of Europe. With that depopulation, the woods came back, the ancient forests, they reforested large areas. And with the forest came the ancient fears. This is the place where wolves are most feared. This is the place where the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood lives. This is the places where the little woodcutter's cottage is threatened by the wolf. All these stories that come to us through Grimm's fairy tales, this is their founding place.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 17, 18, 19. Einunddranzig, 22, 30.
unexplained missing children were a strange thing. Children were dying all the time. The death rate of newborn children was more than 50% in some areas. So it was totally normal that children were dying, but not that they were going missing out of unexplained reasons. So when the stories of the missing children were spreading, that must have been very, very terrifying for the people, because it did not make sense.
This actually fits in with a lot of pre-existing ideas of just plain ordinary wolf attacks. Bedburgs on the edges of civilization, it's on the edge of the forest. Naturally, the wolf would be their greatest enemy.
The villagers sought to entrap him with great mastiffs and dogs of much strength to hunt and chase the beast.
The inexplicable and the horrific was happening, so immediately the villagers started this hunt for a wolf or for some beast outside, when of course they'd have been much nearer the mark if they'd looked closer to home.
The inhabitants found the arms and legs of dead children, to their great grief and vexation of heart.
Now, children being killed and also then dismembered, that's too much. Because who would kill children? Because children are allegedly innocent. This was total riddle. And then always, people, if they don't understand something, they think they should understand everything, because every person thinks he's the smartest and the most intelligent and so on and so on. So like, okay, if I don't understand it, it must be supernatural.
A most wicked sorcerer. Of all others who ever lived, none was comparable unto this hellhound, whose tyranny and cruelty did well declare he was of his father the devil.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster.
In the 16th century, you get a great wave of religious unrest. There was a great change in emphasis on ideas of the miraculous, of the unnatural. The idea that Satan might be able to break the laws of nature in order to punish man's sinfulness.
Adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo.
200 years before, it was thought heretical to believe in the possibility of sorcery and witchcraft. But now, the church had ramped up the pressure. They were burning witches. People were starting to look for more supernatural explanations. And in the absence of any rational explanation, people leap very readily to the irrational.
Yea, it came to pass that if he chanced to spy a company of maidens playing together, in his wolfish shape he would encounter them. While the rest escaped by flight, he would be sure to lay hold of one after his filthy lust fulfilled, he would murder her presently.
Very soon the idea came up that it must be a beast. Now, since people could see that sexual abuse or sexual acts did happen, people got the idea that this had signs of a modus operandi of a human person at the same time, so it must be a man-beast. So the man-beast then would be a werewolf. People don't believe in werewolves anymore, but at those times it made a lot of sense for them. He could very easily be half man, half beast. So it was not a weirdo talk or anything at that point. It totally made sense. It was a reasonable explanation.
Panem celestem accipiem et nomen Domini invocabo, Domini non sum dignus, ut intres subtectum meum sed tam.
The idea that the killer would be among them, would be part of them, is so terrible that they can't accept it.
Corpus Domini Iesu Christi custodiet animam meam in vitam aeternum. Amen.
It undercuts their very notion of themselves as decent Christians living this rural life. So they project their fears out onto another, onto a diabolical creature.
Corpus Domini Iesu Christi custodiet animam meam in vitam aeternum.
People want to think of paedophiles a two-headed monster and that they're easily identifiable because they're not like us, you know, normal folk. You know, unfortunately, that's not the case. Some of them are very good-looking, very plausible, very charming. You know, they have a superficial charm about them as well. You know, they're very good at manipulating and lying and creating an exterior and taking people in. They can go under the radar for a long period of time.
Stube Peter. An ancient dweller, brought up and nourished in the town of Bedburg. He had a fair young daughter who was called by the name of Stube Biel, whose beauty and good grace deserved commendations of all those that knew her. Biel! The first fruit of his body was his son, in whom he took such joy that he did commonly call him his heart's ease.
From what we understand, the public persona of Peter Stube was quite a respectable citizen. He would be known for generations. Presumably his parents and grandparents would have been known, so his place in society would be fairly fixed.
He was, on the surface, just a regular sort of individual, regular villager, but actually he was someone and something very different.
daughter he lusted after most unnaturally, and cruelly committed most wicked incest with her, a most gross and vile sin that doth drive the soul into hellfire.
Even nowadays, we have a voracious appetite for hearing about the stranger in the bush with the balaclava who's going to come and kidnap our child. The majority of abuse, by a long way, takes place at the hands of those who we know. The classic modern example is Joseph Fritzl, the Austrian, you know, absolute aberration. I mean, inconceivable what he did, really. So inconceivable, nobody ever guessed. Within that small German village, likewise, they don't want to believe that something truly repugnant is happening within their own community or within the next-door neighbour's house.
The inhabitants of Bedburg saw themselves so grievously endangered that few durst travel without good provision of defence, and all for fear of this fierce and devouring wolf. If any man or woman missed their child, they were out of hope ever to see it again alive. Oftentimes, he would go through the streets in his former shape, according to the proportion of a man, and very civilly he saluted those whose children he had butchered.
According to the pamphlet, we know that the search was underway to find this inhuman creature. That's not to say that some within the community didn't have their suspicions about other individuals in the village.
As a serial killer, you run often into troubles because somebody sees you at the wrong location, wrong time, something like that. And this threatens the serial killer a lot. It's a real problem. They have to solve the problem. And for them, since they are already very antisocial, totally antisocial actually, for example, in Stubbe's case, having sex inside of the family, having a dysfunctional family structure and so on, then a very logical step for them is to kill people who are standing in their way. For them, it is a necessary step.
On a time, this cruel and greedy wolf met with 2 men and 1 woman, whom he greatly desired to murder. In subtle thought, he craftily crouched out of sight. As soon as they approached, he called one of them by name. The party, supposing it was some familiar friend, went from his company toward the place, of purpose to see who it was. The rest of his company expected still his return. But, finding his stay over long, the other man left the woman and went to look. Woman. Then, seeing neither of both return again, in heart suspected that some evil had fallen upon them, and therefore, with all the power she had, sought to save herself by flight. The men were after found mangled in the wood. But the woman's body was never after seen, for she, the caitiff, had most ravenously devoured, whose flesh he esteemed both sweet and dainty in taste. The villagers daily continued their purpose, and daily sought to entrap him. Continual prayer was used unto God that it would please him to deliver them from the danger of this wolf. And although they had practiced all the means that men could devise to take this ravenous beast, they could not in any wise prevail. The matter ensuing doth stand for a special note of a cruel and hard heart. So great was the joy he took in malice, that he accounted no day spent in pleasure wherein he had not shed some blood, not respecting so much who he did murder. He enticed his beloved son into the fields, and from thence into a forest, where Stube Peter made excuse to stay about the necessaries of nature. delight in murder exceeded the joy he took in his son. In the shape and likeness of a wolf, he most cruelly slew him. Which done, he presently ate the brains out of his head as a most savory and dainty, delicious mean to staunch his greedy appetite. The most monstrous act that ever man heard of. For never was known a wretch from nature so far degenerate. Stube Peter was greatly inclined to evil and the practicing of wicked arts. The devil, who has a ready ear to listen to the lewd motions of cursed men, promised to give him whatsoever his heart desired. And so the devil transformed him into the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf.
The pamphlet emphasizes, insists on something that we find very strange. We find it impossible to believe. We find in the pamphlet the idea that he commits his crimes in the shape of a wolf. There have been many explanations of what this might be, whether there's some kind of underlying psychological explanation.
Clinical lycanthropy is basically a syndrome where a person is deluded, quite firmly deluded into believing that they are an animal of some sort. Generally speaking, with lycanthropy, we're talking about the wolf. We're talking about someone who feels that they are actually wolverine and will go on all fours and will bark and grunt like an animal. And Peter Stube certainly fitted the mold. He appeared to have a belief that he was a beast, that he was wolf-like in his activities. He would attack the weakest in the flock. He would eat his victims, which animals do and humans very rarely do. And he would actually suck the blood of them. And that is something which would align him with the animal, along with his callous way of killing them. I think that he must have had the belief that he himself was a werewolf.
And here is to be noted a most strange thing, which setteth forth the great power and merciful providence of God. The wolf could not pierce the collar of the child's coat, being stiffened and close clasped about her neck. As the Lord delivered Goliath into the hands of David, so was this wolf brought in danger of these men. Thereby, the shape of a wolf clean avoided, he appeared presently in his true shape and likeness.
And this is the key moment in it as a werewolf narrative, as a werewolf story, is this idea that those eyewitnesses saw that transformation. Without that, this is not a werewolf story. As to what really they saw in the darkness of the forest, perhaps they were chasing a real wolf and stumbled across Peter Stubbe. Who knows? Who knows? But they saw what they believed was a wolf transformed into a man, and that brought together all the supernatural explanations, and all their fear coalesced into this single man that they caught, and Peter Stubbe was now their judicial victim.
Thus, being apprehended, he was shortly after put to the rack in the town of Bedburg. But fearing the torture, he voluntarily confessed the villainies which he had committed.
Well, Peter Stubbe confessed all his crimes, which is how we know all the details of his incest and his murder of his son, his cannibalism, all the various other things that weren't seen by the villagers. It says that the confession was voluntary. This is a little bit of a 16th century fiction. Basically, the preparation for interrogation was to be shown all the instruments of torture. The rack, of course, famously, which you would be stretched out on until all your limbs were dislocated. To be shown them, in inverted commas, quite often meant being put on them and given a preparatory stretch, perhaps not enough to dislocate the limbs, but there would certainly be what we would think of as torture.
Was he a wolf? Well, we know that he wasn't a wolf. But thinking that he is a wolf seemed to suit everybody. That was allegedly his confession. We don't know that for a fact, but it certainly suits people to make out that there's this side to him that's animal-like and beast-like. It's always a lot easier for people to think when something horrific happens, the person who's done it is a monster, is evil, is not one of us.
Stubbe Peter was judged first to have his body laid on a wheel, and with red-hot burning pincers to have the flesh pulled off from the bones. After that, his legs and arms to be broken with an axe. Then to have his head struck from his body.
If he were a werewolf, they do not want him to come back and do the same. So you have to deal with him in a certain ritualistic way. So the breaking of the limbs and the decapitation had to be done so that he could not come back as the beast.
The whole thing was truly horrendous. The way in which they killed him was almost as horrific as the crimes that he had committed.
The villagers watching this thing, their own bloodlust, which is expressed in the story of the werewolf, is being slaked by this. They are getting their pound of flesh, quite literally, and in doing so, they're casting all their sins into him and cleansing themselves of it. It's the symbol that this terrible episode has passed and that the villagers no longer need fear this beast that had dwelt within them.
Also, his daughter was judged to be burned quick to ashes the same time and day with the carcass of the aforesaid Stube Peter.
The whole family is infested with this evil, and the whole family has to be extirpated by that society. They have to have no shred of that family left in their society. Any bloodline left within the community is going to bring back these terrible memories.
Thus, gentle reader, have I set down the true discourse of this wicked man, Stube Peter, which I desire to be a warning to all sorcerers and witches who unlawfully follow their own devilish imagination to the utter ruin and destruction of their souls.
This society set out to find a werewolf. They found Peter Stube. And it suited both them and Peter to say that he had been a werewolf. That doesn't quite get away from the fear that is living in everybody's heart in this case, that it's actually the human aspect of the man-wolf. It's the man who is committing the crimes. Wolves, natural wolves, don't rape, they don't commit cannibalism, they don't murder in the same way as the man in this case. The insistence that he is a werewolf suits them because it absolves them from this fear that actually the most terrible beast of all is man.